Alright, we're going to finish chapter 16 of Mummy the Will and the Crypt and finish the book as well. So, Johnny's adventure in the Glomus estate has come to an end. It burned down. Fergie and the professor were arrested. Johnny was unconscious for 2 days. But the professor assured him if anything happened to his grandparents, the professor would take care of him. And we'll pick up from there. Johnny was going to say something in answer to the professor, but the old man turned away quickly and walked to the window. As he stood glaring out at the snow-covered hillside, he harumphed loudly several times and clicked his false teeth in and out. The professor hated it when he got emotional in front of other people. Then he sat down and talked with Johnny about his father. Johnny stayed in the hospital in North Conway for a week. During that time, the professor went on living at the expensive hotel, and Fergie stayed with him for a day or two. Together, they visited Johnny at the hospital every day. Finally, Fergie gave a statement to the local police. Then he went home on the train to Dustin Heights. After the police got statements from Johnny and the professor, an inquest was held. The coroner's jury decided that Chad and the other three had died of unexplained causes. Acting on information from Johnny, the police went out to the Glomus estate, poked around in the ruins, and found the broken, charred statue of Godfrey de Bouillon. Tapping it with hammers, they discovered that the base of the statue was hollow. A sliding panel of stone could be pulled back, and inside the base of the statue they found a small heap of ashes. The statue had fallen into the basement of the burning building, and the heat there had been so intense that it had been like a brick oven. The will of Mr. H. Bagwell Glomus was gone forever. Johnny was unhappy when he heard this. But now that he knew his grandmother wasn't dying, the will had become far less important to him. The professor merely repeated what he had said when he heard that Mrs. Woodley had died. Good riddance to bad rubbish. After a week, the professor drove Johnny home to Dustin Heights. When he arrived, he got lots of hugs and kisses from his grandmother, who was bustling around like her old self now, and Grandpa shook the professor's hand so many times the professor finally had to tell him to stop. That evening, Fergie came to visit Johnny. Despite their chats at the hospital, they had not had a chance to have a really private conversation. So the first chance Johnny got, he took Fergie up to his room, and they had a long and excited gab fest. Later, while they played chess, it occurred to Johnny that he had at least gotten one good thing out of this whole mess. He had found a new friend. The next day, Johnny went back to school. He tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but everyone had read about Johnny's adventures in the newspapers. They all wanted to ask him questions, and some kids even wanted his autograph. So by the time he left school at 3:15, his nerves were thoroughly frazzled. As he turned onto Fillmore Street and started walking toward his house, he found that he had yet another jolt in store for him on this busy, trying day. There was a car parked in front of his house, a sleek black limousine with a chauffeur at the wheel. A wild thought leaped into Johnny's mind. Could it be his dad? But it wasn't his dad. Johnny's grandmother met him at the door. She was clearly upset and nervous as she explained that there was a lady waiting for him in the parlor. Johnny felt let down, but he was still curious. Who could it be? When he walked in, he saw seated on the couch a tall, haughty-looking old woman. She wore an expensive flowered silk dress and a pearl necklace. Rings glittered on her fingers, and her iron-gray hair was arranged in a ripply, permanent wave. When she saw Johnny, the woman smiled. Surprisingly, it was not merely a polite smile, but one of genuine warmth and friendliness. "How are you?" she said, rising and holding out her hand. "My name is Annabel Glomus. My husband was H. Bagwell Glomus. You've heard of him, I suppose." Mrs. Glomus's eyes gleamed with amusement, and to Johnny's amazement she winked at him. Johnny began, but he couldn't get any farther than that. He was really tongue-tied. Still smiling, Mrs. Glomus sat down again, and Johnny sank into a seat next to her. What on earth did she want? Then Mrs. Glomus picked up her large patent leather purse. She opened it and took out a checkbook and a gold-plated fountain pen. As Johnny watched, she began to write out a check. "I have heard about your exploits up in New Hampshire," she said, with a faint tinge of amusement in her voice. "And I must say that I'm sorry, profoundly sorry, that the famous Glomus puzzle led you on a wild goose chase and almost turned out very badly indeed. For myself, I never thought there was a will at all. I believed the puzzle was merely something dreamed up by my late husband to drive us all mad. But now that it seems there was a will, I must say I am extremely glad that it was destroyed. At my age, I have no stomach for bickering. It was those greedy sons of mine who advertised in the paper and hounded me into putting up the reward money. They both thought that the will would make them richer. though I could never figure out why. I mean, my dear sweet late husband was capable of doing a lot of things. He might have left my sons a bundle. On the other hand, he might have left his money to the Ku Klux Klan, or to a cat hospital in New South Wales. So on the whole, I think we are much better off with no will at all. But since you did find the will, that is, you found it where it was hidden, and fair is fair, I want you to have this." When she had gotten out the last sentence, Mrs. Glomas tore the check out of her checkbook and handed it to Johnny. It was made out to him for $10,000. Johnny was stunned. He tried to say something, but once again words failed him. While he was stammering, Mrs. Glomas stood up and started to leave. At the door she paused and turned back to him once more. "Good day to you, young man. I hope you do something enjoyable with the money, and I hope you will realize that not all of the members of the Glomas family are like my late husband's sister. Some of us are quite sane and reasonable, and nice people, too." And with that, Mrs. Glomas turned and swept grandly out of the room, leaving Johnny alone with the check in his hands. As soon as Johnny had recovered from the shock, he ran out into the kitchen to tell his grandmother and grandfather. "Well, my Lord!" exclaimed Grandma, holding the check up and peering at it in astonishment. "Who would have thought? I mean, heavens to Betsy, who?" She handed it back to Johnny and shook her head solemnly. "Well, my boy," she said, putting her hand on Johnny's arm, "this really has been a time of surprises for us lately. Do you think the surprises are all over with, for now, I mean?" Johnny said that he figured there were, but he was wrong. In fact, he had just barely finished speaking when there was a loud squeal of brakes outside. His first thought was that it was Mrs. Glomas coming to take the check back, but when he rushed out to the bay window in the parlor, he saw that the car that had just pulled up was khaki-colored. On its door, words were stenciled in white paint, "U.S. Army." Then Johnny saw the door on the passenger side open. Somebody got out. With a joyful whoop, Johnny rushed to the front door and tore it open. He galloped across the front porch and down the front steps. Standing next to the car was a man in a gray U.S. Army Air Force uniform. Battle ribbons and medals covered the left side of the man's uniform jacket, and on his cap and shoulders were the insignia of a captain. His face was craggy, seamed with wrinkles, and deeply tanned, but in spite of the tan, the man's face looked pinched and worn, as if he had been through a bad time. Nonetheless, he was smiling broadly and holding out his arms to Johnny. Rushing forward with happy yells and yips and whoops, Johnny threw himself against the man and hugged him tight. The man hugged him back, and now he was crying. The two of them just stood there, holding each other, for a long time. And that's the end of The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs. I think it'll probably be about another year before we get back to the stories of Johnny and the Professor, and there are quite a few more. I do want to apologize that wasn't really a sequel to The Curse of the Blue Figurine. I don't remember what I thought the connection was, other than that it had Mummy in the title. The next two do link into each other and make a big story, so next time we do it, it will be 2 books in a row again. But we will see you in the next read aloud.